He wandered one day into a little chapel, and he later told his friends that he heard Christ on the cross, on the crucifix, speak to him. And he said it was something he heard with his own ears, not in his head. And the words that he heard were this, and that is, "Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into disrepair." Now, Francis, at this point, was still quite a practical thinker, and so he went to the local equivalent of an Ace Hardware, or whatever served for it, and gathered building materials and started to rebuild that little chapel. Over time, and with the counsel of the pastor of that little chapel, from what I understand, he began to recognize that it wasn't the physical building of the church that he was called to rebuild. It was rather people's spiritual building, the structure that held them together in relationship to God, in relationship to Jesus, and in terms of living a life fulfilled and informed by the gospel. Well, I think that same statement, that same call is extended to each of us today. Go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into disrepair. We see that with the ecosystems. We see that with what we're going to share with you shortly. I think it's very appropriate, given the fact that Francis was a poet. If you've ever read his Canticle of the Sun, you know how good a poet he was. To hear a modern-day poet maybe give a little take on all of this. And so we're going to go to Amanda Gorman, a young Catholic from Los Angeles. And three of the most famous lines that she's uttered is, "For there is always light. If only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it." And I think we can give that a little added dimension to say that if we hear those lines, "For there is always light," as Francis understood, God is always present. There is no place God is not. If only we are brave enough to see the light, if only we can shine the light to illuminate the truths that might be hidden, to illuminate the situation that is facing us. And only if we are brave enough to be the light, that is, to set forth on the path that we are called to through the voice of inspiration, through the movement of the Holy Spirit. So what we turn to are the Sherlocks, as I call them, of attribution meteorology. This is a new field. And what it is it's a consortium that came together after the year 2003. Europe had its greatest heat wave since the year 1540. It's estimated 70,000 people died in Europe as a result of that heat wave. And this was the greatest heat wave, or the worst heat wave, as I said, since 1540. And to put that in perspective, the King of England then was Henry VIII. So it's well before the time I was born, well before the time any of us were born. The question that these scientists wanted to consider, are there human fingerprints on these extreme instances of weather? And specifically, they banded together from some of the top research institutions in North America, in Europe, and also in Asia. And we continue to see new scientists joining this consortium. What they're looking at is instances of extreme temperature, rainfall, floods, drought, snowfall, and storm surges, the surge of water we see typically before a hurricane. Now, what they did is they started looking at this statistically, and the question, and it's important to understand this, isn't whether climate change caused the event all by itself, but did it make it more likely, and did it make it more extreme? Here are just two examples that we can relate to. One was they concluded the June 2021 Northwest heat wave virtually impossible without climate change. The other conclusion was the northern European floods, the ones that claimed 220 lives in Germany and Belgium, were made up to 9 times more likely because of climate change. As you hold that thought, I will just share with you that this is an issue obviously I care about a great deal. That's why I do these talks. That's why I continue to track the changes in the climate and how they relate to a variety of different systems, and especially to the people and the other parts of creation. I view this definitely as a scientist, atmospheric scientist, meteorologist, and as a science journalist, but I view that at its core, this problem is a crisis of faith and a crisis of values. And that's the larger lens that I look at it with. And I look at it, admittedly, not just as an individual or a husband, but I look at it as a father, and just 6 months ago and a day ago, as a grandfather. And so it gives you, I think, all of us that have children or grandchildren a very different perspective. Given the fact that it is, in my conception, and I think a lot of people's perception, a matter of faith, let's take a deeper look at that. Laudato Si makes the point that some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. We hear that. In 2015, when the encyclical came out, Laudato Si, I had the opportunity to interview the original editor of Laudato Si, Father Michael Czerny, who is now, I understand, Cardinal Michael Czerny. And so I'd like you to go to Rome with me and just understand and hear what then Father Czerny had to say.
Peter's successor, Pope Francis, is seeking to literally upend attitudes toward climate change by writing this new book called an encyclical, Laudato Si.
The woman in the center is a certified crisis intervention counselor. And I posed the question, what is the biggest source of stress that young people report to you these days? I thought it was going to be peer pressures, family pressures, grades, things of that sort, the stuff on social media. What she told me is one of the biggest sources of stress that I hear from teenagers is climate change. They wonder if they're going to have a future. And that blew me away. And it made me realize that I needed to look not only at the scientific aspect of this, but the psychological aspect of this as well. Now, if we have the flu, if we have a broken bone, if we had COVID, do we say, I am COVID, I am a broken bone, I am the flu? No, we say, I have the flu, I have a broken bone. And it's very important to make that distinction between what feelings we are experiencing versus who we are or what our possibilities are. What I'd like you to do is a little demonstration or a little exercise with me. Take your hand and form it into a cup. And when I say go, push it over your nose and mouth and pinch in with your little finger and your thumb and try to take a breath. Ready? Go. Okay, take it away. That wasn't very easy, was it? Nor was it very pleasant. We're going to do it a second time now. And what I'd like you to do, same thing, but when I say go, put it over your nose and mouth. Just move your head away from that hand, maybe an inch, and then take a breath. Ready? Go. No problem, right? The problem has not resolved itself. The challenge is still there. We haven't dealt with that yet, but what has changed is our recognition of it, and our response has changed.